Well, welcome. I'm James Harrison, the Acting Director of the Institute of Employment Rights. If you haven't already done so, please help yourself to the tea, coffee and food at the back that's been kindly provided. Thanks for all coming today to what will no doubt be a useful and informative event. I'm personally looking forward to hearing from the speakers. I thought I'd start us off by explaining where we are and some of the trajectory behind where the report has come from. The general public seems to be starting to wake up to the threats posed by algorithms. The recent book that came out this year, Code Dependent, by AI editor for the Financial Times, Madhumita Mergia, has exposed that there is a whole third world sweatshop industry dedicated to training and adjusting algorithms for the likes of Facebook and Google. Workers sit at terminals all day, viewing hundreds of images and videos and flagging what they are in real terms so the algorithm can learn to refine its processes. Sometimes these images and videos are mundane things like pictures of the inside of a house or a road signs. Sometimes they are explicit videos of things like beheadings and child pornography. The question of what kind of stress and psychological trauma these data centers create for workers is a very real one, as well as the issue of if they're fairly remunerated for the work they do and the resulting trauma. Aside from this is the issue that the workers who do this work are never fully aware of the value of the work that they do. Now, this is a trend in traditional capitalism anyway, where if employers can break up the labour process into its component parts, then workers never truly understand the product or the real terms value of the labour that they put into it, and so can never know if they're being undervalued or shortchanged by the employer. These data centres show a marked departure from normal alienation, though, and it might be better to call it super alienation. Workers only ever see a snapshot of the data and can never truly understand why they're doing what they're doing or how it will be applied in the real world. As you can imagine, workers are treated poorly in this industry. Workers are in a fairly industrially weak position as Facebook and Google outsource the data sets to multiple companies in order to increase the likelihood of the data being consistent. This is not an industry we want to subject our children or the children of any nation to. The tech industry at large is under constant scrutiny for its consistent anti-worker attitudes and excess intensification of work, or crunch, as they like to call it. This term has probably received the most prevalence in some of the headlines around anti-worker and anti-union employers in the video game industry. However, the concerns on workers' rights aren't just confined to the tech or video game industries themselves. They're now leaking into other industries that have either taken up technology, smart tech, or algorithms to manage staff. This is the situation we find ourselves in now. Over the last 10 years, the Institute of Employment Rights have heard various things about workplace monitoring. This monitoring really started off in call centres where it was easy to track what time employees had been on the phone for. We later heard about the occasional rogue employer like Amazon monitoring staff movements and enforcing degrading strict controls on toilet breaks for staff, putting productivity before workers' health. However, it wasn't probably until lockdown that the enormity of this topic really struck me. Professor Philippa here to my right came to speak at one of our online events during lockdown on human rights and employment rights, at a time where there was a distinct blur for many people for where the workplace ended and the home began. There were numerous human rights implications of people being monitored in their own home via Skype Messenger and other almost spyware-like software that employers made mandatory on laptops given to staff to work from, that would track their keystrokes, mouse movements, as well as gain access to the camera and microphone at any time. This opened up a wider discussion about other monitoring techniques like mandatory fitness trackers in workplaces, tracking movement and lack of it, as well as microphones worn around the chest, tracking how much staff were talking throughout the day. The real concern, though, is that other than promoting a dystopian culture of fear and subjugation through this panopticon-like monitoring of those workplaces, beyond the most obvious implications, what were the employers doing with all this data? A year or so later, when we were starting to get back to workplaces after the pandemic, we had a chat with Professor Philippa and Dr. Joe Atkinson here, who started to peel back another layer of this with their work on algorithms and how employers were using them and their data they managed to inform decisions that affect employment rights. After some discussions around this, we realised we needed to create a piece of work to raise awareness among trade unionists and policymakers on exactly what has been happening. Where's my book gone? Thank you. So this is the book that we produced, excellent publication. Now, I know the title of the book is a little bit of a mouthful, and I know the idea of algorithms can be a bit abstract and hard to penetrate for most people. Now, I'm quite lucky, as I understood what algorithms were already, from studying some elements of machine versus human learning in university as part of a psychology degree. And I'm also lucky enough to have friends who were coders and programmers to have them explain it to me as well. But many people don't understand the idea, and I can see why, because it sounds so arcane as to be almost simply a theoretical idea with no practical application. We hear about algorithms all the time in media and TV and film, but what is an algorithm? So Google says it's a set of commands that must be followed for a computer to perform calculations or other problem-solving operations. So in simple terms, it's a flowchart for a computer to follow when making a decision. Now that doesn't sound too daunting, right? But then there's another layer where an algorithm can adjust its own processes or the flowcharts to constantly redefine its decision-making parameters and how it processes the information that moves through it. This can potentially change from minute to minute, so it's very hard to get a transparent view of exactly what an algorithm is doing at any given time, assess if it's truly effective in real terms, and know whether it is compliant with UK labour laws. For instance, an algorithm might decide that a certain level of productivity is fine today, but substandard tomorrow. An algorithm may decide that your sickness absence is sustainable today, but at the same time not sustainable tomorrow. We've heard about Uber drivers being banned from their work app for all kinds of erroneous reasons when an algorithm goes wrong. If it's possible for Uber drivers to essentially be managed by an algorithm, then it's possible for anyone to be managed by an algorithm. Quite often these algorithms are not compliant with UK labour law, because they're usually based on off-the-shelf packages from Silicon Valley, which raises all kinds of questions, such as how do we ensure algorithms comply with UK labour law and human rights if they're developed under a different legal system in another country? How do we appeal a dismissal decision made by an algorithm? Who goes in the dock from the employer side and an employment tribunal if an algorithm made the decision to dismiss? How do judges ascertain an algorithm made a reasonable decision if the transparency of that algorithm is so hard to ascertain that only a coder could tell you their best guess? How do we know if an algorithm is inherently biased and will continue in a downward spiral of poor decision making? How can we make sure the trade union representatives fully understand the labour process from start to finish if we can never look behind the curtain? How do we ensure adequate voice at work through unions being able to negotiate with an employer about the implementation or alteration of an algorithm if it's ever changing in an almost kaleidoscopic way? And how do we ensure decent, dignified work when a machine will want ever greater productivity when it has no understanding of the human condition, human needs, human limits, or consideration for human long-term health? Now, this excellent publication raises many timely questions, and I'm personally quite proud that IER produced this excellent publication with Philippa and Joe. And I think the trade union movement is way behind on these issues, understandably behind, but still behind nonetheless. And we need to wake up to the threat algorithms will pose by circumscribing our collective rights if left unchecked. And I'm glad this book in the latter chapters starts the discussion on how regulation might be shaped, something which I know trade unionists and policymakers alike will find stimulating. Now, we've got some excellent speakers here on the platform and a nice wine reception and mingle afterwards, so do stick around to chat about the book with us. So without further ado, Philippa and Joe are going to start off the discussion and tell you a little bit more. So please welcome Philippa and Joe.
Great. Thanks for that introduction, James, and for your help in publishing it and getting this event organised today. Thanks also to Mike, Nicola and Anna for agreeing kindly to be on this panel. Very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the report. So what we're going to do is we're going to give a brief overview of the contents of the report, setting out some, not clear enough. I usually don't need one of these, I'm fairly loud, but okay. So we'll start by setting out a bit of context, which James has started to do on what is algorithmic management and the impacts of these tools on workers in the workplace. And we'll think a bit about the current regulatory frameworks we have, highlighting some of their inadequacies before we look to the future and what we suggest needs to be done to ensure decent work and effective worker voice in the age of algorithmic management and AI at work. So starting with the question then, James has already given some context, but what is algorithmic management? What are these systems and tools that are being used? And many people in this room will already know, but in short, algorithmic management is where technologies, usually algorithmic technologies, are used to automate or semi-automate decisions that would usually be taken by humans, historically taken by human managers, and now taken by technological systems. And so these algorithmic systems collect and process huge amounts of worker data and use them to either make decisions or recommendations about all aspects of our lives at work. So it inherently involves surveillance in the workplace, but it goes beyond that to also use technological tools to make decisions actually about people. And so debates about technology in the workplace are nothing new. You know, Luddites, famous example, but this latest iteration of the debate is moving things away from thinking about technology as a destroyer or displacer of jobs and thinking instead about the impact it has on the quality of work rather than the quantity of work. And so that's what we focus on in this report. So let's think in the report, we give a couple of brief illustrative examples about how these systems and technologies are used throughout the cycle of the employment relationship. And the most common use at the moment is in the context of recruitment. And so companies like HireVue, but there are many others, design systems where they can scan and screen CVs, they can assess written responses to application questions, they can even scan and monitor video interviews and come up with assessments, predictions about how effective people will be in the workplace, their communication skills, their reasoning skills, and use those as a basis of who to offer interviews to or who to offer work to. And certainly in the US, most large companies are using this already in recruitment. It's also very common in the UK if you've applied. I don't see many recent graduates in the room, to be fair, but if you have been applying for jobs recently, often there's this personality test stage that you go through or an inbox in-tray exercise. And there's not a human on the other end of that marking that. You answer a series of decisions and you progress to the next stage or you don't, based on a computerized assessment of how well you've done at that stage of recruitment. Once you're recruited, algorithmic management can be used essentially to automate any decision that a human manager would make. So the allocation of work, the supervision of work, and the evaluation of work, just making decisions about promotions, work schedules, etc. So an example of this is Amazon warehouses, where in fulfillment centers, the workers are given wristwatches or handheld devices that tells them which direction to walk, what task to do in very specific orders. If they take too long, if they're walking too slowly and following the instructions too slowly, they get given warnings or the device buzzes. And there's a score, a ranking of all workers using these metrics. If you fall too low down, then you might not be offered work in future. And so decisions about promotion, access to the best work, or potentially disciplinary and dismissal action can all be taken on the basis of these evaluative metrics. Uber is probably the most prominent example of this, where everything from onboarding, as they call recruitment, through to the allocation of work, the setting of pay, You know, how much drivers get paid per ride. There's no human deciding that. That's again based on an algorithm which no one really understands. Right through to deactivating people if their rating falls below a certain level based on how they drive or how they interact with customers. All of that can lead to an automatic deactivation. So those are some of the uses we're already seeing. Could have picked many others. You know, call center workers are having their voices monitored and they're told to speak with more enthusiasm or more compassion. Who knows how long before we get that as lecturers, you know, monitoring students to see who's falling asleep and then giving warnings to lecturers who aren't engaging enough. It's a potential future. Certainly, some of the kind of scaremongering, or not scaremongering, some of the scarier hypothetical situations where companies are trying to develop technologies that read people's emotions or involve neurological scanning, prediction of who's going to leave for another job or who might be involved in union organizing. Those kind of technologies are all in development or in potentially employers want to try and implement them. So we've seen this spreading from gig economy and precarious work, but it's now in most sectors of the labor market to different extents. And it's only going to expand because the employers want these systems to exercise control, and the people developing the systems want to sell them to employers to make a lot of money. So there's a lot of hype around these systems, and whether they actually work is another question. But certainly the industry wants to sell them to companies, and companies want to buy them. So I think we're going to continue to see the expansion of this. So very glad to be able to, you know, there's lots of people working on it, but to be part of the conversation in highlighting it. So I'm going to pass over to Philippa now, who's going to talk about more specifically some of the impacts of these technologies.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks everyone for coming on this evening. Are we on there? So one of the things that we tried to tackle in the report is the extent to which this rise of algorithmic management presents an old challenge or a reiteration of issues that we've previously seen in labour law, and to what extent does it provide a new challenge that we need to address. So it's our view is that it's kind of a mix of both, and there are three key areas of threat that we highlight. So first, and in line with the Institute's kind of real passion for raising worker voice, we think that there is a major threat to the participation of workers within the kind of algorithmic management space, both in the terms of the design of the systems, but also how they are implemented, what data is gathered, and how that is used. There's a real problem here with a lack of transparency. The TUC has done really excellent work surveying workers on how this is being used in their own workplaces. And for a lot of those people surveyed, the honest answer was, I don't know, and I don't even know how I would tell if I was being managed by an algorithm. So that's a real problem in terms of then going to your union representative and saying, I want you to take action on my behalf. You know, where would you even start if you're not sure how you're actually being managed and what the role of technology is? There also a big uphill battle is that some of the legal rights are quite complex and overlapping, but also obviously the technological expertise is a real stumbling block for people trying to sit down and negotiate with employers. Workers may not feel like they are adequately equipped, and often managers may be being pushed to use systems that they themselves are not comfortable with or not understanding the nuts and bolts. One of the reasons for that is that often you're purchasing in software that is designed to fill a specific purpose, but you may not understand how that purpose is actually being filled as the manager that is relying on that software. So for example, HireView is a massive business, but you know, how many people that rely on HireView and the rankings it produces, how many of those could actually tell you what's going on underneath the lid of the algorithms that are producing that information for them? So if they were challenged by a candidate, did you discriminate against me? They're going to have no honest answer as to whether that's true or not. The second major area of challenge that we highlight in the report is a challenge to decent work. So one of the things that we've seen most prominently, for example, in the Amazon example that Joe gave, is kind of a de-skilling of the workforce using algorithms and monitoring processes to kind of extract knowledge from the workforce and then kind of separate the labour process into small tasks, increasingly smaller tasks, so that everybody is only in charge of a tiny piece of the puzzle, and therefore they find it increasingly difficult to understand how the whole picture fits together, and as James was saying, to kind of know their own value within that system, or deliberately removing their value, because actually all the knowledge now lies with the company through the algorithm. We also see a dramatic intensification of the pace of work or the expectations around work, whether that's the Amazon pace, which is the expectation that members of staff should be walking as fast as possible throughout the working day, so 8, 9, 10 hours of walking as fast as possible with as limited time off task as you can manage, which includes bathroom breaks, for example, or any time spent talking to your colleagues. And you can also see that not only does that intensify your work pace, but you're also being subjected to increasing levels of control. And this is something that really Labour scholars have been noticing more recently. And that's not just, you know, the algorithm at the Amazon kind of example, but also drivers, logistics workers. If you're working at a screen that everything is being tracked that you're doing, you might have a video monitor on you as well. Your voice, your enthusiasm level, you know, all of that is being monitored and therefore attempted to be controlled by your employer. And generally, I think that we're seeing a real dehumanization of work. Not only your relationship with your manager is kind of mediated by this really complex technological process that neither of you probably really understand, but also often the systems are designed to separate workers from each other, to remove opportunities for solidarity, for collective conversations about how you're being treated. And that feeds into this general threat to human rights that we've seen. Obviously, data and kind of the observation of humans engages a really significant risk to the right to privacy. We've seen a lot of discrimination. There's bias in the training sets that are used. And also, even if you don't code in discrimination into your algorithm, the algorithm, as Joe said, is constantly evolving, and it might evolve and pick up biases along the way. And as the humans that are meant to be operating it, we may not audit that accurately. We may not spot that until it's too late. And then if we're thinking about the kind of solidarity aspect of things, like I said, you could deliberately design your workforce to keep your workers apart. And as Joe said, this kind of hotspot mapping of where unionization might be likely in the future, so that you can then respond to that risk. I say risk if you're the business. We've already seen that being reported in the United States. And there's also a really strong kind of chilling effect on your freedom of expression, whether that's online because you're conscious that you're being monitored, but also within the workplace. And so why are all these risks kind of coming to pass so quickly? We go on to the next one as well. Well, obviously we know that there is a legal regime that these systems should be responding to. One of the problems is that we have kind of non-jurisdictional designers, so people designing in a very low regulation jurisdiction like the United States, and those products are being imported into the UK and used in a different context to the one in which they were designed. But we can see that there are a huge range of rights that should be shaping how people are managed, whether by an algorithm or not. You've got health and safety law, collective bargaining and trade union rights, unfair dismissal law, equality law, data protection law, you know, a whole range of different things. And those should be shaping how we're treated at work. The problem is that a lot of those rights in this, when they're applied in this space, have quite big limits, either in their scope, you know, who is entitled to those protections, or within the content themselves. So for example, a data protection impact assessment could be a really real tool for good here. It's required with any high risk decision making, which a lot of what Joe was describing would be classed as high risk. But the problem is there's no obligation to consult a union in making your impact assessment, and there's no obligation to make that impact assessment public. Similarly, if we think about unfair dismissal law, which is what I spend way too much time thinking about, there's a lot of procedural protections in there that could prevent exactly this kind of dehumanized decision making, but as we all know, the personal scope of unfair dismissal law is hugely narrow. Only after 2 years are you entitled, and only if you're an employee, which is a really privileged class of people within the workforce. And the people that are being subjected to this kind of treatment are much more likely to be precarious, short-term. They might be on independent contractor contracts, and all of those other problems that we see with the traditional personal scope debate. So we can see that whilst there is a set of regulations that could be touching the sides of this problem, often it's ineffective or simply ignored because the employers know that it's too difficult for workers to take them to task and really enforce those rights. So I'll hand back to Joe to talk about some of the reforms that we suggest.
Great, thanks, Philippa. So if we are currently in a situation where algorithm management is clearly a problem and a growing problem, and one that's not addressed by the current law, which is either inaccessible, ineffective, or just substantively inadequate, what are we proposing or suggesting should be done about it? Well, if you'd asked the current government, Conservative government of the past few years, then nothing needed to be done. It was adopting a very hands-off approach. In fact, even removing some of the existing data protection rights that are in place, limiting automated decision-making. The current Labour Party response is somewhat unclear, although definitely more positive. The latest version of the plan to make work pay has a vague commitment to put worker voice at the heart of the digital transition, and some minimal commitment to worker consultation in the space. So that's some positive, and we've seen the TUC propose legislation in this area, which we very much hope will be taken up and built upon. And so we are sort of definitely rejecting that hands-off approach and trying to think about some of the detail of what might need to be done in this space. And so a preliminary point that we make is that the rights that we're talking about, the individual protections and information rights, need to be decoupled from the existing frameworks of employment status. So rather than tying them to contracts of employment or worker status, if you've got rights that are protecting you from being unjustly treated by technology, then everyone who is subjected to those technology, whose working conditions are determined or significantly influenced by algorithms, should have rights to information and to challenge those decisions. So that's going to include some people that we would traditionally think of as self-employed, who are nevertheless managed, their work processes are managed through these algorithmic systems. The second overarching proposal we make is to strengthen worker voice, make it effective in this area. So unions already are, and in some cases successfully, trying to negotiate over the use of these technologies in the workplace. There are examples in the UK and beyond about people, unions successfully pushing back and getting agreements about what these tools can be used for, i.e. not allowing them to be used for worker evaluation, but only for health and safety issues, for example. But too often they're hampered by a lack of information about how the processes, how the systems work, and a lack of rights actually to bring the employer to the table or to have their voice heard. So in terms of ensuring effective voice in this area, we suggest, along with other people who've made similar suggestions, is to introduce an auditing system where there's transparency obligations that employers have to say, make clear what technology is being used to make what decisions based on what data and what processes for human oversight are in place, and what mitigation steps have been taken to prevent harmful effects and ensure legal compliance of these systems. So those are an extended version of the data impact assessment regime we already have, but crucially, as Philippa said, with some worker participation involved and to make those public. We also suggest a series of new individual rights, including prohibiting some practices that that just cannot be justified. So those scaremongering things that I mentioned about monitoring or predicting emotional states and trying to manipulate those, preventing full automation of some important decisions, or monitoring particularly personal data. Individual rights to human review and explanation of decisions, as well as to challenge decisions, both individually and collectively, that we think violate rights. And finally, a new enforcement regime to make sure that these rights don't fall into the same trap as our existing frameworks of not having any real teeth. So a single labour market enforcement body or a specialist regulator that's looking into these, overseeing the auditing and the licensing of technology, and also to make sure that liability for violations goes down the supply chain. Too often, the tools being implemented, even if you impose liability on employees, they actually are not in a position to prevent that harm or remove it, because it's baked into the design. So by the time it comes into the workplace, it's already predetermined the impacts they're going to have. So by imposing liability, joint liability down the supply chain, we hope to incentivize worker voice and participation at that earlier stage in the auditing process. That was a very whistle-stop tour through the report and our proposals. Happy to pick up on any specific areas in questions. To wrap up, we think that there's significant challenges from these algorithmic management practices that require new rights, but also they're not insurmountable if action is taken early, and perhaps even provides an opportunity to improve our overall employment law framework by enhancing worker voice in other areas and improving individual rights and enforcement as well. So I'll leave it there. We've spoken slightly longer than we intended to. Thanks for bearing with us, and looking forward to hearing responses and questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Joe and Philippa. Plenty to think about there. So many implications on this topic, isn't there? And regulation and enforcement are really at the crux of this discussion as well. So thanks for taking us through the highlights, the whistle-stop tour, as you say, of the publication. If you don't already have a copy of it, at the end, there are copies here, so take some for yourself, for your colleagues. Help yourself at the end. Right, okay, so we've got an array of speakers, excellent speakers, I should say. The next speaker that we've got up is Mike Clancy, who's the General Secretary of Prospect, and he's the TUC spokesperson on AI. Welcome, Mike.
Okay, well, thanks very much. So I won't go over to the detail because it's been covered very obviously more than adequately by our authors. I'm Mike Clancy, General Secretary of Prospect. Some of you in the room will know who Prospect are. I'll just say a little bit about us, because anything that I say, my credentials are based upon the people that I have the privilege of representing. We're primarily a private sector trade union, though we have a substantial membership in central governments and in parts of broadcasting, particularly the BBC. In the private sector, we're in film and TV, we're in energy, defence, aviation, science, telecommunications, technology, and so on. And to some extent, we're the organised middle class. Our membership can be affected by these issues in a number of ways. They designed them, our tech worker members designed them. A lot of our members supervise and manage others, so they are implementing them, but they can also be victims of them as well, in terms of their own performance management measures, the tempo expected, and the response from the people that they're dealing with in that respect. I'm also a member of the ACAS Council, and ACAS is one of the few tripartite spaces left in our architecture of employee relations in this country. And whatever happens in the future, ACAS is going to be very important to a whole range of these policy considerations, and like many institutions has gone through years and years of underfunding, and therefore how we are going to handle this, how we're going to talk to employers, how we're going to talk to trade unions, how we're going to talk to civil society, all of this will need to be thought through. Now, my overarching response to this is that actually we should not be the union movement should not see itself as victims, and the members that it represents as victims in change. It's the responsibility of trade unions to equip members for change, to resist it where it's badly done, but to actually prepare them for change in the economy. And, you know, it's clear we do not have the legal framework to enable that in the way that we wish. But there are international comparisons which I think we can draw upon in terms of particularly in other countries where the social construct allows for trade unions to be deeply embedded in change, to prepare people for labour market change. And we certainly work with a number of our sister unions in the Nordic space to learn from that. In order to be credible on this subject, what the trade union movement will have to address is its own problems, and that's particularly in the private sector. 13% trade union membership in the UK private sector, 21% collective agreement coverage. And if there is a change in administration on the 4th of July, and if that administration is going to get 2 terms, judging by the polls, the most important thing the trade union movement can make sure that rises from that 10-year period is that it's at 26% and maybe 35% of the workforce in the private sector organised. Because the right will come back round again. And if we don't achieve that organising target in the private sector, the next time it's the turn of the right, depending on the, you know, the political system we continue to have. Public sector will look like an oddity if it's still got trade unions, pensions, a degree of collective voice. The real crisis for trade unionism is in the private sector in this country, and it's got to be addressed. And I actually see this whole space, whether it's algorithmic management or the broader environment of the use of artificial intelligence, the best opportunity for trade unions to get back to what they used to do really well, which is know the craft, know what our members' jobs are, know what the job pressures that our members are under, be able to talk to employers about the workplace better than some of their managers can do. The places that we are strongest as a trade union, we enjoy 80–90% trade union density. It gives you a representativity and a weight in the labour process debate. And this is just the latest generation of the labour process debate. It gives you a weight of expertise, of leverage, if needs be, but mainly of influence, to ensure that the technological change that hits you is mediated in an appropriate way. Now, that's the most important thing I think that we need to take out of this, that, you know, we must not be seen, we must analyse the challenges, we must analyse the threats, but we must give a confident prescription of how we're going to handle this for the UK workforce. Because I do think it's just another set of challenges which crashes into the weak employment rights we have in this country. Now, the history on this is not auspicious. We haven't done just transition in this country very well at all. There aren't many examples. People always quote to me the Lucas plan, and if you actually look at it, it didn't actually make much difference to defence workers. So just transition, the climate aspect of it, but the whole workplace transition in terms of the next wave of technological insertion, we've got to do this better than we've done it in the past. And I come from an environment in Liverpool where, you know, the insertion of technology and the consequence for workforces up there is something I grew up with. And again, that comes back to the regime that you operate in. So unions got to be careful, got to be clear that they can actually produce credible alternatives and credible arguments. Might seem strange coming from a trade union official, but, you know, engaging with members on pay and their terms and conditions is quite episodic. It's around a bargaining round. It's at a particular calendar and a particular point in time. And actually, you know, one of the biggest problems we have in this country is institutional free riding, particularly in the private sector where people are covered by collective agreements and they're not members of the trade union. Organisational design, job content, the impact of artificial intelligence on the workplace as we go forward, algorithmic management is daily. It impacts members in all sorts of ways on a daily basis, which gives trade unions an amazing opportunity, if we can grasp it, to be influential in a way that we haven't been for a long period of time. Now, you've got to do the pay and conditions, the equality work, and ensure that you're delivering in those. But we've got to go back to the craft and work out how we can be influential on the productivity debate, on how people are deployed, the dynamism of the workplace. And a number of the things in here, which in the IER report I'm particularly interested in, is this question of technology reps, how you equip people for it, what sort of response we need to build. you know, whether it's the TC or trade union affiliates, we've got a long way to go and a big and difficult journey on this in this respect. We spent 14 years of dealing with a government that has basically put us under an attritional pressure on our resourcing, on our own people, on our representatives, and therefore our ability to handle this will require some degree of civic society support and a positive government approach. Now, look, I'm going to say a couple of controversial things. Look, I'm a Labour Party member. I don't subscribe to the betrayal narrative that sometimes hangs around the Labour Party. As progressives, we're always going to be disappointed in some things the Labour Party does and want more, and that's perfectly legitimate. But I was asked we had a reps call 200 of our representatives a week or two ago. I was asked about Labour's plan to pay and the current, you know, narrative that it make work pay, the New Deal. Is it actually a disappointment? Well, look, if it isn't Labour, what is it? If it isn't voting for change and the Labour Party to be in power substantially on the 5th of July, what's the idea? And I think, yes, there are things, many things in here which need to be fleshed out. But this gives us a framework to hang things on over 10 years. What the Tories did to us in the 1980s, in hindsight, is what we need to do now. A 1980 Employment Act, a 1982 Employment Act, a 1984 Employment Act, a 1988 Employment Act. The drumbeat was relentless. And you then look back over 10 years and you think, wow, look what they've done. That will be my measure of this Labour government, and if it's got 2 terms, what did they do successively to change that, to move us away from pure market dynamics, to give people voice at work, and to address this next challenge in terms of technology. So, you know, the right to switch off does need amplification in here. Trade union access, physical and digital, will need amplification. Surveillance subject to consultation and negotiation. Well, look, the problem is we don't have rights that guarantee consultation and negotiation now on existing change. If Labour's serious, it will have to address those things. We dealt with Twitter, we know about P&O. You know, we talk about this stuff, but there's stuff been going on to people in this economy under the current circumstances, which need addressing. What we'll also have to do, and I'll sort of close on this point, there's a lot of really important contributions here. The TUC launched the Artificial Intelligence Regulation Employment Bill a month or so back. We have this IER contribution, and we know that Labour has some plans. What I think we'll need to do is reduce some of the plurality and come to a set of proposals that actually are effective and which we can start to lobby a potentially Labour government on. And I'll close on this final point. A good example of the problem we have in the trade union movement is we go after the wrong things. At the current minute, we're completely obsessed with day one rights for unfair dismissal. And all we're going to end up doing here is applying an inadequate unfair dismissal regime on day one, rather than renovating the actual unfair dismissal regime as a fundamental, removing the untrammeled prerogative that exists within unfair dismissal, the band of reasonable responses, the fact that the tribunal can't substitute its own view, the fact that it's a week's pay is capped, the fact that other parts of the award are capped. If we focused on that and renovated unfair dismissal, and you play that back into these sort of challenges, HR would transform within months. Workplaces would transform within months because they'd know the game is up. No longer can you get rid of people up to 2 years. No longer can you get rid of people on spurious basis because you're probably going to win at the tribunal or buy it out. It would change things considerably. And thanks for just listening to me on that, because if anyone's prepared to listen to me, I'm going to keep saying it, because it is definitely more important than having a day one right to a poor unfair dismissal regime.
Thanks very much for your thoughts there, Mike. I take your point about the chicken and egg situation with density and organising and the tripartite system, etc. I mean, trade union density, as we all know, has gone down by design since Thatcherism in the 1980s, as Mike quite rightly pointed out. That slice-by-slice approach that they took, we need to be mindful of that. But, you know, union organising is just as important, I think, probably as making sure that we try and push the UK legal system back towards the tripartism that is sadly lacking. Something the Institute regularly touch on is the need for sectoral collective bargaining in this country. That's you know, already a fixture of several European countries and works very well. and it would allow the union movement, the space to organise and boost itself, as well as to negotiate on things like algorithms more centrally in industries. Yeah, there's some interesting points to consider there. And I take your point as well, Mike, on the New Deal. We'll get this, and then we'll have something else. Thank you very much. And then something else. We've got to learn from that strategy that Thatcher did. Although we may not like Margaret Thatcher, we've got to recognise that it was clever what they did in terms of the statute, and try and learn from that where we can. Thanks again, Mike. Appreciate your contribution there. Okay, well, we'll move swiftly on to our guest, Anna Thomas, who's the director and co-founder of the Institute for the Future of Work. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me here. It's an honour to be on this panel with some of the leaders in this space, including Mike and Philippa. The Institute for the Future of Work is an independent research and development institute with a mission to shape a fairer future through better work. I'm going to change what I was going to speak about to fit in what we've heard and try and add a little bit of new perspectives and perhaps some evidence and new evidence that's coming out, which goes to sort of support and highlight the importance of what we're talking about today. It's really important, I think, that there are initiatives and research in this area like this. This is not a niche area. And the sectors and the ways in which it's affecting work and unions as well is definitely not linked to the gig or platform economy, which has been thought for a very long time. It's everyone, it's all sectors, because we're in the middle of a structural transformation of the economy that's largely driven by AI and automation technologies, which is changing, we think, the nature, the terms and conditions and the experience of work. And its environment and the relationships as well at work. So this is happening on different levels, and they're all coming together in a way that you're probably feeling. It's happening at a macro level, so it's rewiring labour markets in the sense that it's changing jobs, who has access to them, and how they're distributed. It's happening at a firm level. Philippa's described so clearly sort of what's happening in forms of algorithmic management. And it's not often a stark choice between automated decisions and not automated decisions. Increasingly, it's the decisions in between that are partly automated or informed and are not just traditional functions of management, because we know that traditional functions of management are being automated or partly automated. It's introducing new functions to management. So in a sense, it's increasing the managerial prerogative. And these include new predictive, advisory and mediating functions. And they're often combined with other types of activity or impact, such as nudging or controlling ways in which work is carried out or undertaken. And the example Philippa gave of intensification is a really important one, where the number of tasks you have to do is slowly and incrementally increased. And it may not be done in a way that is visible or explained, which comes to the crucial area of transparency information, which I'll come back to. It's also, I think, important to think about how it's changing not just relationships, but the balance of power in the sense of access to the information and knowledge which is needed to understand what's going on, to shape what's happening, and of course to understand the impacts on rights and enforce them. And it's also happening, having done macro level, big layer level, firm level and individual level, to individuals who are interacting with algorithmic technologies and AI in many ways, with different hats on and with different with different sort of consequences. Our research is showing that some of them are very helpful. They can be used to remove sort of dull or dangerous jobs, for example, or to augment what's happening, your skills and the jobs you're doing anymore, and that's often the case. But also at the same time, they can be used negatively, and our research is bearing that out very clearly, that there are positive impacts and often negative impacts at the same time, and those have to be understood and weighed to determine what sort of action you want to take. And these are changing, as Mike has said, job design and the nature of work, but they're changing sort of really, and the quality of work, things like dignity or control you have over it. But they're also changing really tangible things that are kind of at the heart of collective bargaining regimes, pay and terms and conditions, so how much or how you're paid, and how that's varied, for example, and how and whether you can access the next shift. So against that background, these changes can either be really obvious when something specific, a big system is introduced, not just a robot, it could be an invisible algorithmic system, but more often it's going to be subtle and incremental now. It will be the addition of a sort of feature or an app. And I'm not just talking about Microsoft Office. And so it will slowly build up over time from something that may not be a significant impact when it starts, or may not be recognized as one, but could incrementally become very significant and have significant impacts on health or terms and conditions of work. There is, I think it's worth highlighting, we think, the general tendency of AI and algorithmic technologies towards concentration. So there's plenty of research on that happening at different levels, at a firm level, at a national level. We've got new research coming out next week, which really highlights this happening at a regional level as well, and at an individual level too. And we've got to think about increasingly new impacts that are sort of subject to sort of quite early research, but are coming through in our research streams. So these are group impacts, cumulative relational impacts, but it's really very hard for a single individual, possibly impossible to ascertain until after it's happened. And that points to not only the importance of union roles in their traditional functions, but also potentially new social roles for unions, which is very important. And very important to highlight at this moment in time. So a whistle-stop store of some evidence we've got that backs that up. I think I'll highlight just two things that we've done recently. We've done a firm level survey with a business school that has demonstrated that high involvement practices, so participation, correlates with better outcomes, and that includes job creation and also job quality. And we've also done a survey, both of these with university partners, of 5,000 workers across the country, which shows that perception of rights, because that's how we had to assess it, research it, correlates again with higher work quality, and specifically things like flexibility or the ability to progress in careers, as well as actual objectively, improved work quality. And so these again are important, I think, evidential bases which could underpin additional rights in this space. And of course, a bunch of other things to say, which I should probably not say because I've had my 10 minutes, but I would like to compliment Robin here, who's on the AI Acts, then by the TEC. We were involved in that working group, and highlight a very important part of that for unions and your work, which was the advanced impact assessment, which I think you've recommended in your rights too. And we think can be introduced as part in voluntary agreements as part of collective bargaining. That would be a good opening to set up a process with agreement where these kinds of impacts can be monitored as a process for monitoring and assessing them in advance with a checklist. And we've got some guidance coming out with the TEC shortly, which hopefully will go some way to showing how that recommendation made in the AI bill could come to life. Thank you.
Just swap this back over. Superb. Thanks very much for your contribution, Anna. It's interesting, isn't it, how the market is imposing these sort of terms, and how it could be very different if it was done through negotiation and proper planning with a solid rationale behind it to roll out the industry sensibly. And individual rights, yeah, they're clearly not enough to combat this. It needs to be done properly and collectively and cleverly, actually. So thanks for taking us through the research as well. It's clear to me that we're all going to need to work together and talk to each other to get a clear picture on how we combat some of the problems with AI, and I look forward to doing that as well. Thank you, Anna. Thank you. Right, so, sorry.
And also thank you very much to John Hendy for looking over this guidance.
Okay, cheers. Okay, our last speaker before we go to Q&A is Professor Nicola Contouris. He's a Professor of Labour Law and European Law at UCL and previously Director of Research at the ETUI. Welcome, Nicola.
Thank you, thank you. So allow me to start by congratulating John and Philippa for their magnificent work, which we all recognize today. Having spent the best part of the last 2 weeks marking essays and double-checking on ChatGPT, whether a certain paragraph could have been tested through the algorithm, I just couldn't resist the temptation last Saturday to ask ChatGPT what it thought of this. So remarkably, already last Saturday, he said, I'm quoting, "It is considered a significant contribution to the discussion on the impact of technology, particularly algorithms, on the workplace and workers' rights. The book addresses the evolving nature of work in the context of digital management and explores how traditional labor rights are being challenged and reshaped." And that overall, if you're interested in the implications of technology on labor rights and the future of work, algorithmic management and a new generation of rights at work is likely to be a thought-provoking and insightful read. Look, I mean, from what you've heard, this is surely the understatement of the year, okay? And proof that generative AI has yet to come of age, but that's a different story. This is a book full of great ideas, are very much spot on. They're actionable, they're well thought. Not going to add anything to what they say, but allow me to make 3 quick remarks, 3 quick considerations drawing from the work. As acknowledged by the authors, but also acknowledged by Mike and by Anne, much of the inadequacy in dealing with these risks that we've spoken about is linked to the weakness of our existing legal frameworks. It's not just that we're missing new rights for new problems, but what we have at the moment is inadequate. I would like to stress how important it is to strengthen this legal framework in order to future-proof our working lives, in order to make sure that whatever new rights emerge from these debates are embedded on solid foundations that make these new rights workable. A simple example, partly drawing on what Mike was saying on unfair dismissal laws, surely it would be great to introduce rights based on the human in command principle, and there's plenty of great examples in this wonderful publication. But let's be honest, at the moment it would take a very brave and generally empowered worker to monitor, review and reverse decisions taken by a multi-million AI system that we've been told about, credited with quasi-esoterical learning, generative abilities, and backed by an almost infinite amount of data, and no less importantly, backed by the stick, backed by the managerial power that is inherent to decision-making processes in all workplaces. AI systems are managerial tools, we've heard it tonight, and as such, they're really an extension of management, of managerial powers, and they're vested with the same extension of managerial authority that managers have. And at the moment, several regulatory aspects of the employment relationship, from the duty of obedience and cooperation to the manifest weaknesses of unfair dismissal legislation that we've just heard about, suggest that such a principle would just ring hollow unless it were accompanied by a new underpinning of working agency in the workplace, both through individual and collective means. So we really need to take seriously the challenge put before us by our 2 authors, but also by the discussants tonight. We need to generally tweak and reform our existing legal framework in order to be able to embed these new rights on solid foundations. Otherwise, they will simply not work. The second consideration, and again by reference this time to the new ad hoc rights that such technologies will require in order to give protections in modern workplaces. I think it's important to think about new rights, but it's also important to start thinking, and we did it tonight, but there's, I think, more discussion to be had, on prohibited and authorized uses of these technologies. This is a difficult conversation to be had, as these conversations typically in the workplace are bottom-up ones, and they don't go terribly well. But even so, I think it calls for two things. First, there needs to be a public law intervention in regulating certain uses of AI systems, including through outright prohibitions of certain high-risk users, and other users being perhaps only permitted under strict conditions and strict regulatory and technical standards. Public law has always performed such a function in respect of any technology introduced in the workplace before this fifth industrial revolution. Privacy laws and health and safety legislation have been at the forefront of this discourse in recent years. Explainability is great, you know, negotiating the algorithms, fantastic, and it's really important. It'd be great to have AI reps in the workplace. But when I use an AI system at work, or I'm subject to it, I need to have a certainty that this system meets certain standards set by standard setting authorities. It's the same expectation that I have when Joe switched on the computer before, and when a metal worker operates a mechanical robotic arm in a factory. I don't need to be an IT expert to operate it. And the metal worker, doesn't have to be an expert mechanic. We know and expect that these machines comply with certain standards, that they have some safety devices and switches, and that certain harmful things they will simply not do to us. There is, in other words, a lot of work to be done by statute, by public bodies, by regulatory authorities in this domain. This is not just a private or collective labor law question. We heard a lot about this. We also heard actually about enforcement. I would ask you to read very, very carefully the final part of the book, because it's really full of interesting ideas. So as Joe and Philippa noted, AI is running wild in a general anomie and absence of rules, both private and public, and this will need to be redressed. Now, a third and final point. I'm not sure whether this is a shared feeling in this room, okay, but I miss the EU when I think about artificial intelligence. It's not just a Ramona kind of remark. Okay? In the past few years, while Westminster was busy running Partygate inquiries and passing Minimum Service Levels Act, those pesky Europeans were adopting an AI Act banning certain AI applications. That's a regulation. It's the most powerful type of act, of statute that they can apply. Banning certain applications deemed to create unacceptable risks, and at least proposing some rules for other users deemed to be high risk. They approved a platform work directive with new rights, individual, collective, dedicated to platform workers subject to algorithmic management, all platform workers, as Joe and Philippa noted in their book and in their presentation. They adopted a new machinery regulation, substituting the old machinery directive that defines the mandatory essential health and safety requirements that machinery products must fulfill to be placed on the market. And in this case, as well as procedures for assessing their conformity, including for machinery assisted or operated through AI systems. They proposed, it hasn't been adopted, a new AI liability directive that would extend some common liability principles contained in other product liability directives to AI systems, as well introduce a new important procedural principle, such as a rebuttable presumption of causality. If I continue on the detail of this, I think you fall asleep, so I'll just, but they've done quite a few things, okay? This is not a remoaning comment. They're simply ahead of us. We'll need to keep an eye on what they do. If you don't want to just spend endless hours and months and years reinventing the wheel. And if we want to continue to be good neighbors, including in terms of trading with them, because these standards are essential for them in order to trade on goods that are AI related. Thankfully, Joe and Philippa are already doing this for us. In fact, there's quite a few references to the platform work directive now adopted. And I think they even go beyond these minimum requirements contained in the directive on a number of points, suggesting that the UK could and should do more than what these minimum requirements entail. We can only hope that a copy of this pamphlet will reach the right people on the 5th of July. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Nicola. Very astute observations as always, and you point specifically future-proof our rights because the existing framework's not enforced enough. That's really at the heart of this, isn't it? Because if we get new rights and they're not enforced, it's just not going to work. So it's an overall sort of an overall overhaul, if I can say that, that's needed. Right, okay, time's been ticking on. We've gone a little bit over. Shall we take two very, very quick questions before we go to just having a chat afterwards with the wine? And I don't know where the wine is yet, by the way. We need to make inquiries there. So if you can indicate, is there any ladies who'd like to ask a question as well? Okay, there's a lady in the orange dress and then this gentleman in the white shirt.
We're also happy to chat over the wine if we don't manage to get any questions answered in the panel.
Sure.
Good evening. Can you? Yes, you can. My name's Andrew Buck, and I'm a barrister. I specialise in stress and bullying and harassment at work for about the last 20 odd years. Far too long, some would say. One of the things I've been doing is representing people who've been working so hard they've actually caused themselves to have a psychiatric breakdown. You know, they've been through the medication on coffee and so on and so forth, sleepless nights, working weekends and so on and so forth. One of the things that struck me about what I heard from the panel was the amount of information that will be available to employers to help me as a lawyer sue the employer, because they ought to have access to information about how people are working. And let's face it, most people overwork and cause some unfortunately cause themselves injury. And looking at the way that the health and safety executive have approached work and things like discrimination at work, bullying, too much work, not suitable for the job, that sort of approach. You know, I deal with cases where the risks are so huge, but at common law, it's really difficult to persuade a judge that actually this was foreseeable. And in a sense, what I was thinking about was what Lady Hale said in the Hatton case. You know, what ought to be plain and obvious to a reasonable employer. We now ought to start thinking about what ought to be plain and obvious to a reasonable algorithm, having done all the research, monitoring how many hours somebody's been putting in, possibly even realizing how they've been bullied by certain managers and so on. I'll leave it there anyway.
Thank you.
Just wanted.
Appreciate that. Lady in the orange dress, at the back.
Thank you. It's been really interesting. And I just wanted to ask about so you mentioned towards the beginning that one of the biggest uses at the moment is in the recruitment process and in screening. And understandably, because we're sort of labour lawyers and focused on rights at work, a lot of the discussion afterwards was more about, controlling its use at work and the dehumanizing effects. But I wondered if you had more to say in the report or otherwise just about that issue of, you know, how to regulate the way that it's used in recruitment, whether there's a need for more transparency, you know, for for employers to be producing statistics on how many people they're employing of different protected characteristics and so on, or what kind of regulation is needed at that stage?
Thank you. Who wants to come back on that then?
I'll do, yeah, first. Okay. So you can, yeah, okay, great. So I think both very pertinent points. So on the reasonable algorithm point, I definitely agree in principle that that's what should be happening. You'd hope that this information would put employers on notice more frequently of potential duty of care issues that would then help you establish foreseeability or causation, particularly as there's evidence of increased stress at work when people are managed by these systems. Whether that does filter through to the tribunals in practice, you'd be the better judge of predicting that than me, but it will depend on how willing people are to take that evidence seriously. And then on Natalie's point about recruitment, yeah, I think it's a really good point. The transparency obligations that we talked about and the audit, the fact that that's public, that would then be available to job seekers as well. So there's some degree of that built in.
Yeah, thank you both for those really interesting points. Yeah, to pick up on the point about recruitment, it is under kind of emphasized, I would say, because it's so, the effects are so hidden. Because a lot of people, when you say, well, when you put in your CV or you upload your video, it's not a human that's grading that, it's an algorithm. They're really, really surprised by that. Even the generation that are coming through and graduating, for example, seeking their first role, professional role now, they are generally quite surprised. So yeah, I think reporting obligations that would apply also to those uses, and that would enable unions and other interested parties to try and spot some systematic issues that might be happening across a whole sector, which would perhaps indicate that the training data is flawed or that the expectations are not able to be matched by certain groups of people. And that might not just be protected characteristics, there might be other things that are going on as well. And just to loop back to Andrew's really thought-provoking point, you could also think about the fact that the algorithm we could place a duty on it to preempt and prevent the psychiatric injury, right? What would a reasonable algorithm do? It wouldn't push people so hard that they break. So that's something that we haven't thought about before, but it's a really interesting point, so thank you for raising it. And I'll hand back to James to wrap up.
Sure, yeah, I think the wine's on its way. It looks like it's in transition. Anyway, you'll be glad to hear. Right, so what I was just going to say, is there any, given that we've got a little bit of time, the wine isn't here yet, is there anything that the other panellists might want to just briefly say before we completely wrap up? No? Go on, very quickly, go on.
Just about the health and safety regime question in particular. What you've said in a way speaks to why there does need to be additional regulation, because there are gaps between the health and safety regime and labour, traditional labour rights as well. Equality and data protection for sure. But for now, using a sort of advanced process and a checklist, so toolkits that are produced by sort of organisations like ours may help. So we've gone through, for example, a checklist and shown that there is evidence that it might impact in these in these 10 ways. And so if that becomes normal practice, and we have done guidance for both employers and we will be for unions as well, if that becomes established practice, employers would be really best advised to consider as early as possible whether it might impact these things, which would go to helping in the slightly longer term demonstrate that it was reasonably foreseeable that it might have impacted in these key areas, which of course include mental health and psychosocial harms, but often those can also be a window into other types of harm.
Great, thanks very much, Anna. Anything else before we close down?
I'll just make a quick comment.
Yeah, go on.
I mean, I think what is often underestimated as an information source is trade union casework, and we get a wealth of issues raised with us, and I think most trade unions at the present minute would say that they are reporting a significant increase in a mental health component of their casework, and that might be driven by a range of things. It might actually be driven by relative isolation, some of which has arisen since the pandemic, and sometimes the way that people are working with relative isolation, which may benefit them in some respects, maybe not benefit them so much in others. And indeed, the report talks about the likely impact upon people's home environments. And there's various evidence about hybrid work and remote working, its benefits, but also its downsides. And if you're under stricter performance surveillance and so on as a result of these techniques, it's likely that that's going to cause more stressors, because what you may be deprived of, but not realize you need more of, is actually the mutual support of being with people. Now, that's also a major organizing challenge for us. The isolation of people in their homes, do not mistake, is a huge organizing challenge for trade unions going forward. You don't have the same networks and touch points that we had, and we're trying to devise ways of dealing with that. But our casework tells us there are far more challenging issues here coming through, particularly with a mental health component.
Thanks very much, Mike. Any final thought, Nicola? Or?
On this particular point, there is a new class of health and safety risks being elaborated, both in academia but also in policy, called psychosocial risks, and will be hopefully a proposal for a new regulatory instrument in Brussels, and it speaks exactly to this kind of problems that are linked to technology, to remote work, to the intensification of work due to technology, and so on and so forth. And that goes beyond psychiatric harm, damage, every other categories that already exist in for employers' liability.
Right. Thanks very much. Thanks to all our panelists here. I'll just do a quick wrap up before you can help yourselves to the wine, and we'll have a nice chat. So it's clear from the contributions this evening that the future is unfortunately not always bright. The future does not bring this inevitable linear positive progression for humanity as the tech industry and big business would have us believe. Progress has many paths to tread, and sometimes if we aren't careful, the future can lead us to dystopia. If workers are to have dignity at all in the future, then we need to find a way to regulate these algorithms, as we've spoken about tonight, through law, state regulation, licensing, enforcement bodies, to challenge the algorithms' monolithic private stature and bring them under proper public and democratic control. And this really is an ongoing conversation, something that needs to be done thoroughly if we are to tackle the issue effectively. And I look forward to working with the people on this panel and broader trade unionists, policymakers and academics in order to make a difference for the next generation of workers. So what better time, I should say, to start than now. So stick around, let's have a glass of wine and a chat. Thank you.